Great. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we will crack on. We're currently waiting on one of our panelists, who I believe is stuck and is on his way. So hopefully he will come during the talk. Unfortunately, Dr. Sid Koshal isn't able to make it as well. I think there are some issues. It's clearly not just limited. I hope wasn't too tough for those of you coming up from London and further afield. And we really appreciate this great turnout for what is, I think, a very important and timely discussion. So again, the theme today, sea change in the Baltic. How are we able to really secure the critical infrastructure, whether that be energy networks, telecommunication networks, other types of infrastructure in regions like the Baltic. And we have a distinguished panel here to delve into this topic. We have some very expert people here to speak on energy. We have our guests from the Navy, as well as all the way from Copenhagen, Dr. Savilo here. So without further ado, I will introduce our first guest. Hi, please take a seat. Our first guest is Commodore Andy James. Commodore James serves as a deputy director within the Defense Nuclear Organization in London, with over 25 years' experience in the reserves and the Royal Navy. His early career was focused on seagoing roles in operational submarines deployed around the world. Since then, Commodore James has served on the staff at Britannia Royal Naval College, as well as at headquarters roles, including at U.S. Central Command, twice in Navy Command Headquarters, and UK Strategic Command, and now in 3 different roles in the Ministry of Defense. He has an undergraduate engineering degree from Edinburgh University and postgraduate qualifications, including a master's in international security from Massey University in New Zealand and an MBA from Cranfield University. And Commodore James is also a chartered engineer and fellow of the Institute of Marine Engineering, Science, and Technology. He was a First Sea Lord Fellow from 2022 to 2024. Commodore James, you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. I think I'm going to open by saying thank you because it's a real privilege to be here. Thank you for the kind words and the introduction. Captain Brian Trim and I, really pleased to be here to represent the Royal Navy. I think a really important discussion this evening on a set of really important topics. I'm going to open with a couple of remarks. First of all, I'm just going to talk a little bit about where we from the Royal Navy see this event sitting in the context of some other engagements that we have. And then I'm going to just offer some opening thoughts and remarks, observations from my perspective, obviously a very defence view, but perhaps nesting a sort of wider set of considerations, which I hope will lead nicely into the experts, frankly, who are going to take us through the core of the discussion, I think. Professional head of the Royal Navy, the First Sea Lord, hosts an annual conference called the Sea Power Conference, and this is part of a range of activities that are intended to foster a dialogue and exchange, if you like, between private and public sectors, bringing sort of military officers like Brian and I, officials, parliamentarians, industry, the media, and academia all together to discuss a range of pertinent topics. From a practitioner perspective, from a professional naval officer perspective, we need this dialogue. My whole career has been in the Navy. It's all I've really ever known, and occasionally we need to break out into something new and get those different perspectives in. It stimulates. Hopefully it also challenges at times. It certainly keeps our conceptual edge sharp, which is really important to us. This year's Sea Power Conference is taking place in Lancaster House in London later on in May, organised and hosted by the Council on Geostrategy. Thank you. And this is one of the side events to that main event. So that's the context and a little bit about why we're here. Before we hear from our experts, I thought I would just offer a few personal reflections on how we see, I think, from a defence perspective, the Baltic and some of the changes we've seen in the last 2 years. And I think the first is to make an observation about how defence thinking has shifted in the 2 years since the invasion of Ukraine, or the further invasion of Ukraine in early 22. There has been really significant shift in defence thinking. I'm sort of minded of those words. I mean, whether it's Hemingway or whoever it is about bankruptcy, it happens slowly at first and then suddenly. I think there's been a gradual shift in thought process within defence for some years, but that change from the slow to the sudden happened in early 22. And they've made a number of, I think, quite profound changes in the way we view security, the role of defence, and how we might go about our business. I'll touch on some of them, and perhaps more will come out in questions. The first is, I'm going to make an observation about the role of NATO. So I've been in the Royal Navy long enough to remember, say, 15 years ago or so, some really serious questions about where NATO was going, the role of NATO, its credibility and utility. It was a topic at staff colleges. People wrote papers on it, books on the topic. The events of the last 2 years have fundamentally shifted our public perception, I think, of the role of NATO. And I think that makes a really profound difference to how we view defence from within the Ministry of Defence. There is, again, a renewed focus on the defence of the homeland, not just for the UK, but of course for other European nations as well. It's always been there to a certain extent, and of course during the Cold War years was very prominent. But the state peer threat to the homeland looks very different now than it did even 2 years ago, or just over 2 years ago. And of course, we've had a very clear evidence of the vulnerability of energy supplies and its knock-on effect to prices. Public perception and public realisation of the potential vulnerability of our supply chains has been brought home by that. There's a role, obviously, for defence in terms of protection of infrastructure and supply chains, but I would also observe that defence is a user of energy, and it's brought into sharp light how we and what we use as our energy sources to allow us to go about our business as well. So that's the first point. The second point is this is a team sport, and I'm sorry to introduce a sporting metaphor quite so early on, but what I mean by that is that each European nation, whether part of NATO or sort of more broadly, supports and is supported by our neighbours. There's a lot of like-minded thought across defence in Western Europe, and we can't seek to do everything ourselves. So there's a strong element of us being able to mutually support each other, whether that's geographically or in the sort of capabilities that we might bring to the overall. NATO is obviously hugely important in that, and I think the recent expansion of NATO shows that, illustrates beautifully that fairly significant shift in defence thinking in the last couple of years. But I would also mention the Joint Expeditionary Force, the JEF, for which the UK is the framework nation. The JEF is a sort of military partnership of 10 Northern European nations. It generates a pool of high readiness military forces for use, and has become a really useful, flexible grouping to be able to draw down on amongst those Northern European nations. It has real utility and value, I think, to all involved. Alongside the sort of joined-up view from defence and from military, I'd also note, and again, this is not new, is it, that many of the problems we're going to hear about tonight are not solved by defence or solved by the military. They're solved by other actors for which we just need to be much more attuned to their interests and their connections. There's nothing completely new here, but I think the importance of nesting defence capability within a wider national response, and indeed international response, is more important than ever. I think this leads me on to my third point, which is around resilience. It might be a bit conceptual, but bear with me. I think if you look at the lessons from the invasion of Ukraine, whether they be at the tactical level or at the strategic level, a great deal of them can be boiled down to the concept of resilience. I think for a long time, we, both in defence, but I think also in wider government, and quite likely in many areas of the private sector as well, have emphasised and incentivised efficiency and leanness. And those are good things and understandable. But it's very difficult, I'd argue, to be both resilient and truly efficient. And I think now we're stimulating some conversations within defence around trying to get that balance right in a way that perhaps we weren't having those conversations perhaps 2 or 3 years ago. I think there are perhaps also some interesting parallels with European response to the pandemic here and the nature of resilience in sort of non-security related instruments of government as well. Fourth and last from me, I couldn't sit here and not talk about technology. There's an inevitable tightening, I think, of the sort of technology innovation that goes on at times of conflict, and we're definitely seeing that in Ukraine. And I think that applies, to defence's view about where new technology might be taking us. There's an importance in maintaining a technological edge. Adversaries will continue to seek to exploit vulnerabilities, and perhaps vulnerabilities that were not evident to us a few years ago, including through new technology. And potentially our responses will also be technological based. And so the importance of keeping ahead of the technological curve from a defence perspective, I think, is really valuable. A good exemplar of that, of course, will be in the underwater environment and the vulnerabilities that might exist to infrastructure there that we may not have considered quite so important a few years back. So those are, I think, my 4 opening points. Hopefully just set a little bit of scene from a defence perspective and a Royal Navy perspective. As I say, I'm really grateful for the opportunity to participate this evening, and we'll obviously be very happy to take questions afterwards. But I think now is the opportunity to hear from the experts.
Thank you very much. Great. I think that was a very good tour through some of the really important themes that we'll be delving more into, both during the panel discussion as well as in the Q&A afterwards. One of the major issues today, of course, in the Baltic, and we've been talking especially about energy, we've been talking about energy in the Baltic for a very long time, but especially after the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, when especially allies on the eastern shore of the Baltic, especially the Baltic states, have felt increasingly insecure. Of course, for a very long time, they've had their grids aligned with the Russian and Belarusian grids. A lot of the energy, not only, of course, in the Baltics, but of course, more broadly across Europe, has come from Russia in terms of Russian fossil fuels. So right now, we have really been grappling with the question of how do we deal with that? I mean, in a context where a lot of countries have cut back on their imports of Russian fossil fuels, in the case of Germany, one of the prime examples, of course. But then other European countries are still very much continuing to import gas and indeed other fossil fuels from Russia. Of course, gas is one of the really big themes here, and that has really also come to the fore when it comes to the critical infrastructure and preserving that infrastructure as well. Famously, of course, or infamously perhaps, the explosions with the Nord Stream pipelines that we saw before, among many other types of underwater infrastructure, as well as other types of infrastructure that have been affected increasingly in past years. Luckily for us, we have an expert here, and without further ado, I will introduce our next speaker. We have, all the way from the other place, Dr. Katya Yefimova, who is a senior research fellow in the gas research program of the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. She has been an expert at the UNECE, Group of Experts on Gas, since January 2015, and was an expert at the EU-Russia Gas Advisory Council from 2012 to 2016. Her main research areas include EU pipeline gas and LNG regulation, so very important topics here, the regulation of decarbonization, which will be another theme that we'll return to later, I'm sure, and transit security of Russian gas exports to Europe. Dr. Yefimova holds a DPhil in geography and an MPhil in Russian and East European studies from the University of Oxford. Welcome, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Trevelyan, and thank you for an invitation to the centre, and good to see so many of you are here on a very nice day in Cambridge. So I start with outlining a bit of a context for European gas security, because gas is what I work on the gas program at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies in Oxford. So in terms of context, what has changed about gas security and perception of gas security in Europe after 24th of February 2022? So there's very strong now drive, there is very strong political will on part of the EU in particular to eliminate its dependence on Russian gas completely. There is Versailles Declaration adopted to this effect. There is this policy document called Repower EU, adopted in May 2022, on the basis of which the whole host of legislation has already been adopted and in the process of adoption. It's a very ambitious document because it envisages, as I said, complete elimination of dependence on Russian gas, which is not a small feat because Russia supplied about 1/3 of European needs before the crisis. And this Repower EU document, it's not legally binding. It doesn't have this specific deadline enshrined in legislation. But it's pretty much a sort of a political declaration. So the aim is to eliminate dependence on Russian gas by 2027. And Repower EU is basically a host of measures that would have to be implemented for this aim to be realized. But again, it's more aspirational than actually legally binding. As you've noticed, you've mentioned earlier, different countries have different attitudes to imports of Russian gas and different perceptions about security or insecurity of doing so. As you know, the EU and sort of the Western countries more widely adopted massive sanctions since 24th of February 2022, pretty much in all sectors of the Russian economy, but they've been the EU in particular has been quite cautious about the gas sector for obvious reasons, because the dependence was very significant. And but more and more sort of things and sanctions have been adopted since then. But again, there's no complete ban on Russian imports, because there is no unanimity for such a decision in the EU. Nonetheless, what happened, because the crisis, obviously the energy crisis and gas crisis in particular, has been very significant, but now 2 years down the line, it's clear that Europe more or less sort of has weathered it by now. It's been lucky in many respects. There was several warm winters in a row, which means there was less demand for residential heating, essentially, and because prices went from something like $4 per MMBTU to, at the peak, they were about 100, and that meant that a lot of industrial gas demand has been removed, and now kind of the estimate is that probably half of these is probably gone for good, which means that some of the industries in Europe will just close down, particularly things where gas is an important input. So nonetheless, what now happened, Russian supplies into Europe decreased after 2022 sort of by 50%, and in 2023 they halved again. So now Russian pipeline exports into Europe and LNG, liquefied natural gas exports, about 15%. So it's huge reduction compared to what it was. But again, although Europe adopted a whole host of measures how to deal, such as potential gas rationing, etc., which didn't come to that, as I said, for all sorts of reasons, what it meant that Europe also paid a very high price for that, literally, because those member states that could afford it subsidized their consumers for tens of billions of euros. Those who could do that in Europe, and more affluent countries could do more, obviously, and also the price which you see in losing some of the industry. So that's sort of where one is at the moment, and how Europe was also able to deal with that. It effectively replaced these lost Russian supplies by supplies of liquefied natural gas, which is a global market. This gas comes by boat, if you like, from all sorts of places, and the United States was one of the biggest. It's Qatar, it's Australia, and also Russia, which has maintain supplies of liquefied natural gas to Europe. In terms of infrastructure, I want to kind of underline two things about infrastructure. Of course, this physical security of infrastructure, and also whether infrastructure, even if it is physically available, might not be operational for legal reasons. Just for context, in terms of Russian supplies to Europe, you had 4 main corridors. That Nord Stream pipelines, there is the Polish corridor, Yamal corridor, is the Ukrainian corridor, and there is Turkish Stream, which consists of 2 pipelines, and one of which feeds Europe and another feeds Turkey. So out of these pipelines, at present we only have 2 operational, that's Turk Stream, and that is Ukrainian corridor of all things is still operational. In terms of Polish corridor, there are sanctions and counter-sanctions between Poland and Russia, so the pipeline is physically available, but it's not been used. In terms of Nord Stream, you all know very well that now it's physically unavailable, so it's another example of availability. In terms of what Europe is looking at going forward, everyone says that if indeed this political goal is realized, that by 2027 or so Russian gas is phased out completely, that means an ever-increasing dependence on liquefied natural gas, which brings with it its own host of infrastructural issues, because those supplies they come from all sorts of places, and then for that there is another issue, is how one would ensure security of maritime routes, which with the events, for example, in the Red Sea is not something that has ever been taken for granted, I assume, but it's just those examples now show that it's becoming increasingly challenging thing to do, and for example, if you look at gas price behavior in Europe, there were spikes in October last year because nobody quite knew how far the conflict in the Middle East would go. And there were also spikes when the Houthis attacks started, because that influenced Qatari deliveries of liquefied natural gas, which have to pass through the strait. And that's another, those are issues which happen far away from Europe, but they have very real impact on European gas security as well. And in terms of, so in a way, if you go away from Russian gas, you have supplies from LNG, but with that, security questions about infrastructure and deliveries don't disappear. They're just different, and they also would have to be dealt with. So that's important. In terms of infrastructure security, for Nord Stream, as you know, Sweden and Denmark decided to close their investigations, and the German one is still ongoing. And that is the fact that it's not concluded, in a way, sort of looks like an invitation for anyone else you can do such a thing to major piece of energy infrastructure, sort of scot-free, if you like. So that's obviously a difficulty. In terms of Europe and decarbonization prospect, which I have mentioned, another question is that Europe has very ambitious plans for decarbonization. As I said, it views its gas demand falling very significantly and being replaced by decarbonized gas in particular, and electrification of whatever is possible to electrify. And obviously not everything is possible to electrify, so some gas would still be needed, and a huge discrepancy between different scenarios, how much gas Europe might need after 2030, and again depending on how much it will need, where from those supplies would come, then there would be attendant issues in terms of what routes are going to be used. Are they going to be pipelines, going to be LNG, via which routes they would have to be delivered, what are security risks associated with each of those. And that is clearly also a challenge. In terms of sort of looking closer to home, if you like, Europe, of course, has its own domestic demand production, which has now been in a kind of long-term permanent decline. There were a bit of reversals. There are some measures you can do to improve a little bit. but European domestic gas production is declining, so it's not much that can be done about it. One interesting thing to note, of course, the production in the Netherlands is this massive Groningen field from which the European gas industry actually started. It didn't start from Norway, it didn't start from Russia or Soviet Union, it actually started from this giant Dutch field. But because production from this field was causing earthquakes in the local area where it's located, it was political uproar there, and Netherlands really had to close this field completely. There's a lot of gas still there, but it's not going to be used because the politics is such that the field is closed virtually very, very recently. The final closure was made. And that was made after 24 February 2022, so all these gas security issues notwithstanding, that was top of the agenda, and that field is going, and that's domestic gas production. If you look Norway's been pumping pretty much a lot of gas to pretty much at the maximum of capacity of gas to both to the continent and to Great Britain. And again, talking about security, it's a huge amount of pipelines going from Norway to all of these places. Of course, there are also interconnecting pipelines from Great Britain to Northern Ireland and to Republic of Ireland. So all of these things are, they're underwater, and they are very extremely important for ensuring security. So as previous speaker was saying, there is a balance between how you ensure resilience and efficiency, because you can't really put a policeman or naval officer by each mile of the pipeline, and there are lots of them. So that is clearly scale of the challenge, and as wider geopolitics becomes more and more complicated, those risks sort of multiply, and it's, that's, I'm glad it's not me who has to manage this challenge. So I'm just outlining the challenges. And again, to conclude, I guess, but tell me, Trevelyan, if I'm over time. The kind of question which I now touched upon a little bit, what's going to be European gas demand in the future? Because Europe has this renewed drive towards decarbonization, because it now sees decarbonization also as a security issue, because it will be less dependent on imported energy. Whether it's going to be successful, how long it will take, etc. That's very much an open question. And again, another question which is sort of hovering over as well, whether some Russian gas might make a comeback in certain time. Clearly not anywhere near to the level it was before, but perhaps on a smaller magnitude. As Trevelyan said, some European member states don't mind. So that's an issue of which kind of in the future. And to conclude, I think what I'd like to mention is that Europe is trying to deal with the challenge of energy security, with the challenge of decarbonization, and also the challenge of how all of this is going to be financed. Because clearly, if you look at this, all of this looks very, very expensive, and that's of course not a trivial matter. So I think I'll stop on this, and maybe we can address separate issues during discussion.
Thank you very much. That was very much a tour de force. Thank you very much. There's certainly a lot to unpack there. I think you raised some especially interesting points, I think, about how shifting energy routes from the old Nord Stream pipelines and the other routes from Russia into Europe, in terms of thinking about LNG and other new sources, that brings a whole set of new security risks. And this is certainly something that I think we'll probably want to, or hopefully some people in the audience will want to kind of delve into as well during the Q&A. And of course, the decarbonization questions, the issues around the new routes being like Baltic Pipe, the new sort of west to east routes replacing kind of the old Russian east to west, at least for now, right? That could also change, as Katya just mentioned. So again, a lot to unpack. Fortunately, Our next speaker is an expert on Baltic energy security and has herself grappled with all of these major questions. So without further ado, let me introduce our next speaker, who has come all the way from Denmark to speak to us today. We have here Dr. Isabella Cervillo, who is a senior researcher at the Danish Institute for International Studies, where her research focuses on international relations and energy security in the Baltic Sea region, as well as Central and Eastern Europe as well. So very wide-ranging here. Dr. Cervillo's current work analyzes the development of new energy infrastructure projects in the Baltic Sea region, as we touched on a little bit just now, and what role scientific knowledge and technical data play in the decision-making process and public communication around these projects, which are, of course, huge topics, especially today. She also studies low-carbon energy transitions and wider political developments in Poland, Ukraine, and further afield across Central and Eastern Europe. And Dr. Cervillo holds a PhD in international relations from Central European University. We very much look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation and a pleasure to be here. I actually do have a PowerPoint, so if we could, yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So I'll talk about energy security in the Baltic Sea region, and I'll put it a little bit in a geopolitical and historical context, because I think in order for us to understand how the war in Ukraine impacted that energy security, it's also important to understand how diverse the region is and how different energy policy approaches were in that region for many years. Okay, declining. So in the Baltic Sea region, we had a variety of different approaches for many years, starting with Germany, where for many years there was this belief in Berlin that we should work on mutual dependence with Russia, that we should increase interdependence in the economic sphere, and that related especially to the energy sector, that by increasing this trade links with Russia, Russia will be sort of like brought closer to Europe, that it will have a positive spillover effect also to other sectors, such as democratization of Russia, human rights records, and so on. And energy security was perceived in Germany for many years purely from like economic prism. So it was security of supply, but understood really in this like economic dimension. So that was what was the driver of their policy for many years. Then in the Nordic region, we had countries that were very advanced when it comes to development of renewable energy technologies. They were quite self-sufficient, not that dependent on Russian fossil fuels, and they really focused on green transition. And the focus was there on increasing regional interconnectedness and basically regional integration when it comes to electricity market and so on. And geopolitics was not really featuring that highly on the agenda. When it comes to security approach, was more about societal resilience as like a general framework for security measures. And then, of course, we have a post-Soviet sphere, which in the Baltic Sea region, these are the three Baltic states and Poland. And here the view was very different. Energy policy was securitized early on. It was really considered in many of those states as one of top security issues. And that was for a reason. That's because since the mid-90s, Russia recognized that with the loss of strategic military presence in its near abroad, it will start using exports of oil and gas to exert political and economic pressure on energy importing states in a former Soviet region, so former Soviet states and former satellite states. Could we change the slide? That, of course, was possible because of the network of interconnecting pipelines for gas and oil that were connecting mainland Russia with all those reserves with the importing states. And crucially, even though those states, of course, gained independence in the 1990s, they remained locked in this infrastructure, especially when it comes to gas. Because, of course, oil can be diversified more easily, it can be transported via different means, but gas sector is difficult. We need either pipelines for piped gas, or we need liquefied natural gas terminals. And that infrastructure takes a long time to construct, and it's very costly. So it was not easy to escape that Russian grip in the energy sector. However, because, could we change the slide? Because Russia started to use energy as a weapon and started to use energy blackmail on a number of occasions that usually took a form of disruptions of gas and oil supply, as well as different pricing strategies. that usually coincided, there's like high level of deniability to those episodes, but there usually were some developments in energy importing states that ran against Russian interests. So expression of some pro-Western aspirations, politically speaking, like election of pro-Western leader, or a country that was trying to do something very actively to diversify away from Russia in the energy sector. And then the energy blackmail would follow. So based on that experience, energy policy became security policy. It became like basically a matter of national interest. This was very visible, especially in countries like Poland and Lithuania, where policy was securitized. So those countries invested heavily in diversification, also in the gas sector. They constructed LNG terminals, one in Klaipeda, one in Świnoujście in Poland. They also invested in interconnecting pipelines between the countries, between the Baltic states and Poland, and then Poland, Slovakia, and further on to increase regional security of gas supply. Also, one of the most strategic projects, the Baltic Pipe for transit of Norwegian gas via Denmark through Poland, also came to fruition recently in autumn 2022, which is very fortunate. Those projects, of course, took years. They just, like a lot of them, basically started operating in last years. But that's one thing. So one thing is that securitized energy policy means that it's not just driven by economic considerations. It's very much also about geopolitics. So even if we are faced with a scenario that we need to pay more for costly infrastructure, it was still done for security reasons. That also had implications for how those countries approached protection of that infrastructure. So there were hard security measures implemented there earlier on. For example, LNG terminal in Klaipeda, it was like quite heavily guarded from the very start because it's a project of national significance. In Poland, Poland is developing, for example, nuclear power plant, its first one, and from the very beginning, the internal security agency has been overlooking this project, making sure there is no interference of foreign forces, even at the stages of, environmental studies for that project. Go further. So this is domestically. Regionally, this securitized outlook on energy policy was also visible. The clearest example are really the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipeline projects, especially Nord Stream 2, which was constructed after 2014, so after Russia already annexed Crimea. Countries in the region were opposed to that because they thought this is not in our geopolitical interest. It will give Russia a way to pressure Western Europe, but it will also circumvent the entire region and basically deprive so far transit states of important economic fees, but also there was sort of a solidarity with Ukraine on the agenda because there was a belief in Kiev for many years that being an important transit state for Russian gas gives Ukraine certain leverage when it comes to dealing with Russia, that it gives it some political power. So energy policy in the region, very securitized, both when it comes to securing supply, but also when it comes to protecting critical infrastructure. And that geopolitical outlook, there was a big disparity that really didn't start to converge until the outbreak of war in Ukraine. So after the outbreak of war and the subsequent energy crisis, Russia, of course, used weaponized energy also towards Western Europe. And there's this convergence of views in the Baltic Sea region of what energy security is about. On the one hand, we have countries that started to pay more attention to this geopolitical aspect. But on the other hand, we also have countries in the post-Soviet sphere that are also in the need to accelerate energy transition to sustainable energy systems. So they need to invest more because they're usually lagging behind Western countries when it comes to investing in renewables and energy efficiency measures and so on. So this convergence is to some extent on both sides because we are facing this multi-level challenge of phasing out fossil fuels, diversifying away from Russia, but also accelerating the transition to clean economy. So how are countries doing in the region? That really very much depends on their like starting point and their like domestic energy mix, how it looked like before the war. In the Nordic region, which was very advanced when it comes to development of renewable energy, this is still happening. Denmark, for example, plans to quadruple its like wind power development. A lot of this new infrastructure will be sited in maritime zones, which are hard to monitor and protect. So this is one of the issues. New offshore wind parks will be also constructed in Sweden and Finland. Sweden also has nuclear and hydropower, and Finland soon will be self-sufficient when it comes to electricity generation because of development of both wind power and nuclear energy. Wind energy is also being developed to a lesser extent also in the Baltic states and Poland with the involvement of foreign actors and companies. So that's also important. There are other issues here. When it comes to regional gas supply, it doesn't look bad, but that's because those countries started to diversify away from Russia way before 2022. So there were like a number of strategic projects such as Baltic Connector, GIPL between Poland and Lithuania, enhancement on the Baltic pipes connecting Latvia and Lithuania, Baltic pipe, 2 LNG terminals. So now there are more LNG terminals in the region because Estonia and Finland are jointly leasing the floating unit, and there's another one, LNG terminal in Hamina in Finland. So the regional security of gas supply doesn't look that bad, but there are other issues. So for example, Estonia has shale oil, which is good when it comes to securing the energy supply and its self-sufficiency, but it's very environmentally unfriendly, so they need to think of diversification options. Poland, Latvia has a lot of hydropower that was constructed still during Soviet times, so that's environmentally friendly, but they still have problems with Gazprom having quite a lot of say, a lot of leverage in their domestic gas sector. Lithuania is doing pretty well. Poland, of course, struggles with phasing out coal. It's still over 70% of domestic electricity production comes from coal. And Germany, of course, was hit hard by that crisis because gas was serving as a bridge fuel in German energy transition. At the same time, Germany phased out nuclear energy, and it was really reliant on cheap Russian gas. It was a big chunk of its imports. So since the outbreak of war, they had to invest a lot of resources into constructing LNG infrastructure for importing gas from alternative geographical locations. This is, of course, costly, and there were so many plans at one point at the agenda that there were actually worries that this is an overinvestment and potential, sunk cost and creating infrastructural lock-ins going forward, because what are we going to do with that infrastructure in a couple of decades? But this is what's happening in terms of like security of supply, like just traditionally understood. But what the outbreak of war in Ukraine really showed us really is that energy security is not just about that anymore. We have to face some real hard security threats. Of course, Ukraine is an extreme example that showed how Russia could just deliberately target critical energy infrastructure, heat pumps, power plants, pipelines, affecting millions of Ukrainians, especially during the heating season. Also, cyber attacks on Ukrainian power grids. And of course, we do not expect this type of magnitude of things to happen in the rest of Europe. However, since 2022, we have already noticed first incidents of physical damage to critical energy infrastructure in the Baltic Sea region, but also skyrocketing cyber attacks in Europe. Many of them originate in Russia. And they target critical infrastructure in general. It's like part of this hybrid warfare, but energy sector is really one of the highly affected ones. And when it comes to like protection of that infrastructure, when it comes to Baltic Sea region, the region is really getting crowded. So what I just mentioned are all those plans for expansion, for example, of offshore wind farms in the Baltic Sea. And they will be sited, many of them in maritime zones, which are harder to monitor and protect. And we already have pipelines there and electricity, data cables, it's all in proximity. And third parties, including Russia. Russia, for example, has what it's called GUGI. So there is this fleet of unmanned underwater and surface vehicles and drones that can be used for different type of operations that could potentially cause damage. And the very existence of Nord Stream pipelines 1 and 2 provided sort of cover for Russia. Even if the pipelines are not in use, then Russian vessels can monitor those pipelines under the cover of repair and maintenance, and basically, access everything that's like crossing this pipeline. But even if not that, we do have exclusive economic zones in the Baltic Sea, also North Sea, and a lot of infrastructure is sited in those exclusive economic zones. And this is hard to protect and monitor. And what we've learned from the so far incidents, investigations are still pending, but both Baltic Connector and explosions on Nord Stream 1 and 2 happened in exclusive economic zones. This is important because it has potentially different repercussions even if we find the guilty party, because this is exclusive economic zone, so it becomes more a matter of international diplomacy rather as if it happened in territorial waters. We can just skip that, and next one. And so this is like physical infrastructure. There's also cybersecurity. Since 2022, there are skyrocketing cyber attacks. As we can see here, like EU countries were targeted. There are a lot of cyber attacks happening also between Ukraine and Russia, which really shows that this is one of those areas where the hybrid warfare takes place. However, a number of important energy operators in Europe have been affected as well. So this is like ongoing threat, and this also poses challenges. So what can be said about energy security in the Baltic Sea region? Well, it's a multi-level challenge. On a very basic level, when it comes to energy supply, of course, each country has is in different position, has different energy mix. They will continue doing what they're doing to ensure that energy supply. It's very important to have a backup in case there is a disruption in supply or whether there is like a power outage, to have a backup, but also to have a high repair capacity. So if something happens to physical infrastructure, that we are able to repair it relatively quickly and put it back into use. There is a need for regional collaboration, especially when it comes to guarding infrastructure that is sited in maritime zones, because they are often going, across different jurisdictions and different exclusive economic zones of different countries. We have multiple actors, from governing bodies to private businesses, to EU and NATO and so on. There are a lot of discussions happening at the moment how to do that, because this is very fragmented governance. That poses the problem. Another problem is, I think Katja already mentioned that, the problem of costs. Who will pay for that? Because critical infrastructure in Europe in general is like 80% in private hands. In energy sector, a lot of this infrastructure is in private hands. And of course, the companies they don't necessarily have all the technical know-how or resources to monitor and guard all that infrastructure, especially that is sited in maritime zones. So who will pay for that? How to coordinate that? There are also legal issues in terms of interpreting the laws that are out there, and for example, what activities should be allowed in exclusive economic zones, and which should be deemed lawful or unlawful, or should we draw the line, or do we need new regulations there? But regardless of that, there is a need for policy focus, like more resources and more focus to be targeted at monitoring maritime areas, underwater and surface level. Development of new technologies is already happening. Some of them are very advanced. They use AI and information fusion, for example, to monitor different scenarios and to basically try to detect danger and patterns that are happening there. There is a need for information sharing. This goes back to this fragmented governance between different actors that are involved in monitoring these areas, especially that there's no one standard governance model, so to speak. Sometimes we have different bodies in different countries responsible for governing the protection of that infrastructure. So then also becomes an issue, how do they coordinate across countries with each other, how to monitor and protect that. And then final thought is that even though whatever we do, it is a little bit a new normal, meaning that we cannot potentially prevent any, all possible incidents, and something might happen. Most likely it will happen again. So it's important to have repair capacity and technical know-how, but also certain level of societal and political resilience, because this type of incidents, they attract a lot of media attention, but to make sure that the society does not panic necessarily when this happens, because so far those episodes have been quite manageable. So I'll just stop here on a positive note, because I think it was a lot of gloom and doom, but thank you.
I had to take it back to a negative so quickly. But I mean, there's, again, a lot to delve into there. And don't worry, we'll make sure we have, please, yes, please do. Come up and join me here. So actually, let me introduce Captain Brian Trim. So he's joining us for the Q&A. Brian serves as Secretary to the Chiefs of Staff in the Ministry of Defense, and he has over 30 years of experience in the Canadian, Australian, and British navies, a deep specialist in navigation. Captain Trim served extensively at sea until 2015 when he took up shore-based operational roles. He holds an MA from King's College London, War in the Modern World, and an undergraduate degree from St. Mary's Halifax. But the reason why I'm making sure to introduce him, Brian was actually here at Cambridge not that long ago as the Navy's Mountbatten Fellow. He did an MPhil in Politics and International Studies, and at Cambridge he's a member of Clare Hall. So please join me also in welcoming Captain Trim. So before we get into the audience Q&A, I do want to put one question to you. I mean, I've many more, but maybe I'll try to sneak some in later. But one of the things that you just mentioned, Isabella, I mean, we have a lot of countries in the greater Baltic Sea region, especially, of course, in the Baltic Sea, you mentioned Poland as well, not so much Germany, as we heard there, have been really doubling down in terms of thinking about how to secure their energy supplies for some time, well before 2022. In fact, in some cases before 2014 as well. But there were various moments like that really kind of led those countries down that road. And so, in general, for a long time, we've been thinking about energy security really in terms of diversifying our energy mixes and sourcing supplies, diversifying that supply mix. But of course, with the recent incidents, obviously the attacks on Nord Stream in 2022, just in October, of course, in last year, we had, of course, the Baltic Connector disruption, which, for those of you who don't know, I mean, there was a Finnish investigation, I believe. They found that it was an anchor belonging to, presumably, a Chinese ship, so the New Polar Bear, which dragged along and disrupted that pipeline, taking that pipeline offline. I think it just went back online just recently, I think, about a week or two ago. That same month, there was disruption to telecommunications cables between Estonia and Finland and Estonia and Sweden. And also, to be fair, we need to mention there was also disruption to the Russian cable, the Baltica cable linking St. Petersburg with Kaliningrad. So obviously, that raises this question that, again, we've been sort of going around in sort of the panel today on the periphery, but it really is the central question of how do we actually secure the basic critical infrastructure that is transporting these energy supplies and indeed other supplies that we require. And I'm sure our audience is thinking about this. So I just want to put this to all of you and hear what your thoughts are in terms of what can actually be done. You mentioned NATO, Commodore James before, whether it's NATO, whether it's the EU, what can actually be done here to try to the extent possible, to shore up this infrastructure. As Katya mentioned before, unfortunately, we can't station a Royal Navy officer at every connecting point. But what can we actually do here? So whoever would like to take the first shot, go for it.
I'll sing for my supper. So I think the first thing, you mentioned a series of breaks, and I think, if I could just wind the clock back, 10 years ago, I stood at a whiteboard in a room without windows, and we considered options for what we could do about, malign interference with seabed infrastructure. And the small team that I was working in at the time were chastised for being paranoid and a bit Cold War, and would we please go away and take our niche interests elsewhere. That was 10 years ago. Now suddenly everything is vulnerable seabed infrastructure. The fact is there's a base level of breaks, particularly in cables, particularly in shallow waters, particularly in areas where there's lots of fishing and ships anchor. So I think it's important to not see every faulty cable as someone's interfering with it. It does happen that cables break quite regularly, and there are robust commercial arrangements in place to respond quite quickly to that. I'm not an expert on pipelines, but I'm confident there are similar commercial arrangements to repair pipelines and maintain pipelines. So distinguishing that baseline, I think, is an important first step. In terms of securing it, the options to physically secure it are quite few. I mean, it is a vast tangle, particularly in a sea like the Baltic. As we've seen from that map, if you overlay all those layers, and lots of these things are available open source, there's a lot there. You can run periodic surveys to look at the bottom and see what's been added and go down and investigate any changes, but that doesn't mean that you're going to catch everything. So the answer is less about securing it as in guarding it, and more about establishing or re-establishing norms and cooperation that ensures that it is correctly managed in international law. And there are a number of issues around it, particularly when you get into seabed cables. It's a whole separate seminar you could run there. But also about monitoring, cooperating, exchanging information. I think the single biggest thing is what's been mentioned several times is resilience. So when you are running seabed infrastructure, companies will, quite justly, take the most economically effective, the cheapest route to deliver the service. In the absence of a regulatory framework that requires physical resilience in the network, it won't be there. So instead of guarding it, what we need to do is design resilience into it.
Thank you very much. Anyone else?
Yes, I think it's really, I would agree with that point. It's really about the bigger picture, because it's not physically possible to guard every inch. And of course, there are technologies there. It's not like it's just left on its own. There are, like, movement sensors and cameras and underwater vehicles that can also monitor and gather information. There are, like, newest technologies like this seabed to space that are looking at the movement of vessels and look if something is off, trying to analyze all this data. But still, it is a bit bigger about the big picture, because we're talking about extensive area, and it's only it's surface level, it's also underwater, so it is about that. There's also the cyber aspect, right? We are talking about here, like, that potential physical damage to infrastructure, but there is a bit of a blurring of the lines between physical infrastructure and digital, because everything is so increasingly interconnected and digitalized that potential, like, hacking of a system and potential cyber attack can also disrupt the power grid and can also cause even physical damage. So there is also an aspect of cyber measures that should be taken, the protocols that should be in place to guard it better. I just wanted to mention just 2 points here, but I totally agree. It's about the bigger picture and the resilience building. There's also a human factor, though. I attended one conference, I don't remember where it was. Even, for example, when it comes to guarding certain infrastructure, even if we have, like, the best protocols in place, if we hire a spy and if someone who is in charge of these systems will actually do something, get access to them, it is also a risk factor. Then all those protocols in place might not be as effective. Another debate that is sort of happening at the moment is how much of protection might be too much. So, for example, there are different voices in a debate, like, should military personnel protect offshore wind parks? Some would say yes, some would say basically the more protection measures, obvious ones, you put on physical infrastructure, the more of a target that infrastructure becomes in the process if there is conflict, because they are increasingly looking, when this infrastructure increasingly looks like something that should be attacked because military is there. So there are all those different points also connected to that.
Thank you very much.
Just a few points to add. I'd very much agree with the first speaker on, it's important to ensure these things are secure, but again, it's also very important not to be afraid of one's shadow, because sometimes accidents are just accidents, and you look at them and they look horrible, but they're actually accidents, because ships do drop their anchors, and anchors do damage things, and we never normally hear about those things, and we've just heard about it on the Baltic Connect, just because it's such a high-risk zone now and everyone's attention on it, etc. So that's important. And I'd very much agree, again, you can't guard everything physically, and it's important to have resilience. So if something is, is broken down for whatever reason, there are sort of extra margins, both in terms of infrastructure and in terms of energy supplies that arrive through this infrastructure. So you have to have this extra cushion. The problem, of course, this extra cushion would cost extra money. That's one thing. And also, objectively, in terms of supply availability, as we've seen over the last few years, it's just the world has been sort of short of gas right now. One big chunk of Russian supplies was lost. It was difficult to compensate. And when Europe was able to attract LNG, gas by boat, so to speak, from everywhere, from other regions, of course, the other side of the coin was that less affluent countries in the world were not able to afford those supplies anymore. That's important bit. And a more general point, of course, all these things are very difficult, and ultimately what I guess one should hope for, that this neighborhood overall becomes more secure overall, with all parties, are less angry at each other, and like to not in the Baltic Sea. Russia has its territorial sea and its exclusive economic zone as well. So how you reconcile all of these things, obviously, extremely difficult. But it's a big, the context in which everything else is set.
Thank you very much.
I'm not sure I can do much better than the three people who've gone before me, frankly. Obviously, there is a strong element about your mix of generation and storage of energy at home. We've concentrated, I think, in an answer about the sort of the distribution side of the equation, which is equally important today. I think the only thing I would add is the importance of this in the public discourse, which I think has shifted, to Brian's earlier point, in the last couple of years, both in terms of energy, but also sort of wider supply chain vulnerabilities. I think that is healthy, and I think it's helpful to people to understand that some of these vulnerabilities have been there for a long time, but frankly haven't been tested. And now we're now starting to see some of those vulnerabilities being tested, and perhaps that discourse will allow the right conversations about how we might sensibly put in place the right sort of protections and buffers to those vulnerabilities.
Great, thank you very much. I do not want to monopolize the time here. So I would like to open it up to anyone who would like to ask a question. We have a microphone that will be handed around. If you don't hear your voice louder through the microphone, it's because that's actually for our online recording. So do not fear, we can hear you. Yes, the gent at the back.
Thank you. Hi, Patrick Triglav-Cannon. I'm a research officer at the Council on Geostrategy. I'd just like to thank Isabel and Trevelyan and the Centre for Geopolitics for putting on this event with us as part of the CPAL conference this year. It's been a really good scene setter for what we're going to discuss in a few weeks' time, so thank you for that. My question is actually for Isabella, but open to the whole panel. You talked about societal and political resilience and the need to sort of foster that within these communities that are affected by disruptions to energy like we are in the Baltic. Now, this is something I hear about quite a lot, not just in the context of Europe, but, you hear this in Asia and talking about the looming threat from China. And of course, it's more pertinent in Europe given that Russia is engaged in full-scale war. So my question is, how do you think that societal and political resilience can be nurtured? Do you think that's a job for politicians to increase their messaging and to talk to societies more about critical national infrastructure and geopolitical threats? Or do you think that is something more a broader thing, that it's not just the job of politicians, but also perhaps the private companies that are engaged in these energy security matters that we've been talking about? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, good question. I'm not sure I have a good answer, but I just have to say, because I live and work in Denmark, but I'm from Poland myself. So it is very clear to me since the beginning of the war how different societies are and how different people react, and what appears to be shocking in some society and pretty normal in another one. So in Poland, because of all the history of of war, but also like in energy sector of blackmail and so on. People are used to those type of incidents. So like when something happened with the Nord Stream pipelines, yes, it was news on the media, but it was like, oh yeah, well, most likely just another sabotage incident. In Denmark, those things were, they cause more attention, they cause more anxiety, I think, because people are not used to it, because it's been such a long time that things have been like normal and peaceful and the focus was elsewhere. So whose job is it? I think on the one hand, this is going to happen naturally, because as we are, it's 2 years since this conflict started, actually longer, right? Since 2014, really, that it started. As we go on, people are getting more resilient just because like we are exposed to more things happening, not only in energy sector, but when it comes to militarization of the region and so on. Is it a job of the politicians? I think to a large extent, yes. I don't think this is like business of energy companies. I think this should be part, perhaps, maybe of some educational. I'm not saying programs, but this is for also the political elite to set a little bit the tone of that debate, because that's what they're doing, and that debate is changing. So just to go back to my comparison, this debate has been ongoing in Central Eastern Europe. If we look at the Baltic Sea region, so it's just like what happened just reinforces what everyone thought is the case. In other regions where it was more peaceful, the debate has been really shifting, and very rapidly, more rapidly than if nothing was happening and people would just try to, frame it somehow. So I think, I'm not sure I answered your question, but thanks.
Thank you very much. Yes, the lady at the back.
Thank you so much for all of the speakers. I'm Viktoria Dovichenko, representing both Center for Defense Strategies, but also Center for Geopolitics from Ukraine, myself. I have two questions, if I may, and especially it sparks me to the two last speakers, but I'm open if any of other comments will be here present. I wanted actually to refer to some of the analytics that was done by our partner organization, which is called Center Strategy 2021, which is an energy expert field. And they are saying, of course, for this investigation that happens now within Russian interference possible in the pipelines, especially for the Nord Stream as such, and of course for the usage of the sensors that are used in the pipelines for what we say military reconnaissance purposes. And I know that we are talking here about what we say securitization, but also what we call approachment and vicinity for some of the military bases, which is on the Gotland and on the Denmark side as well, very, very close to that. So my question will be, actually, my first question will be, is it still alarming after Finland, Sweden joined NATO? So what will be the response in this sense, in this investigation possible? Do you have some data on that? And I know it's not a topic here, but I'm very curious, whether we have something like that in analysis of the Turkish stream, whether there's an interception of the Black Sea and Mediterranean Sea. Thank you. We were talking about Nord Stream, so it comes to the north. I was thinking about, you were mentioning, Isabella, yourself, about 3 others, which makes sense also for me, interesting enough to see the Turkish stream, also Turkish pipelines coming through from partially on the mainland of Turkey, but also covering a part of the Black Sea and Mediterranean Sea. Do we see something like the same tendencies, that there is the usage of potential usage of the Russian Federation of the pipeline as what we say a weapon for destabilization of the area?
Who would like to take a stab at that first one?
Well, in terms of Nord Stream, as you know, Sweden and Denmark have concluded their investigation. They effectively said, as they are sure that no citizens of their countries are involved, they are not going to indict anyone, and they just closed investigation. But they did confirm that it was sabotage. They didn't name a perpetrator, so we can't jump to the conclusions who that is. Germany is now still doing its investigation. You know, I obviously don't know what it will come up with and when. So that's why, as long as results of investigation are not announced, we can't bring parallels with what might happen to TalkStream or others. But in terms of any infrastructure, any undersea infrastructure, as I mentioned in my presentation, if perpetrator is not named, that kind of serves as an open invitation for further attacks. But we don't know who did it. And in terms of importance of TalkStream, it's a pipeline system which has two pipelines, one of which serves completely Turkey, and the second one serves Southeast Europe, and that it goes up to Hungary, across towards Serbia and Hungary, and it terminates in Hungary. So it doesn't connect any further, so that it serves this limited market. In terms of its usefulness now, and thing which I haven't mentioned in my talk, but it's a very important question, and it's a looming question, what will happen with Ukrainian transit at the end of this year? Because, as you know, there is a transit agreement in place. It expires at the end of this year, and there have been various signals about whether or not it might be extended or any new arrangement would be found. So, and in terms of countries which are still served through this pipeline, there's Slovakia and Austria. So for them, if that transit stops, they probably would be able to secure supplies through other routes, but price implications for them would be significant. There are various studies and estimates how much prices would increase. In terms of Hungary, it now rerouted mostly, so most of Russian gas that Hungary receives now goes through TalkStream. So TalkStream is of importance, of big importance for Hungary. And in terms of Ukrainian transit continuation, we've heard from various Ukrainian officials, public statements, that some of them say there's no way there's going to be any new transit arrangement. It's over at the end of this year. Others were saying, well, if Europe wants it, we can continue, and then the agreement would have to be reached between Europeans who are interested in continuation and Russia. But for this to be achieved, there would have to be an agreement between Ukrainian transmission system operator and Russian, which is effectively Gazprom. How realistic it is, it's anyone's guess in current circumstances. Europe or sort of the EU Commission, high-level officials basically said they're not putting any pressure on Ukraine to continue. So Europe as a whole can do without this transit if it stops at the end of this year. But for individual countries, particularly Austria and Slovakia, that would be a bit of difficulty. So it's a looming question, and so far there's no answer to that. But that's not physical security, that's sort of legal, contractual, regulatory security. Well, and physical as well, because obviously the pipeline runs through the territory where there's active combat.
Great. Thank you very much for that very comprehensive answer. I just want to make sure as many people get to ask questions as possible. So I'm going to take three. Yes. And yes, so we'll have 1, 2, and then is there someone else who'd like to ask a question? Yes, and then 3 over there. Great, please.
Donatas Kupčuna, Center for Geopolitics. I have a question about gas imports in the Baltic states. How much of the Russian gas are they still getting today? And in particular, are they getting any Russian gas repackaged as non-Russian gas, for instance, when it comes to LNG gas trade? And is there a methodology to sort of figure that out? Thank you.
I'm curious about the quality of the infrastructure when it comes from non-military risks. So, for example, the Swedish nuclear power plants have had multiple occasions over the last 2 years where reactors have been taken offline for other technical issues. And I wonder if this is a long-term issue. Same thing when it comes to electric grids, for example, when it comes to heat waves, the climate-related issues. If the nuclear power plants, for example, in Sweden, which have faced other technical issues that are unrelated to Russia or security, if those nuclear power plants, you think, stand up to the national needs, or if there are other concerns that you think exist that are not related to the military side of it, if that makes sense.
Like the French issue. For example, I presume you mean, like, for example, in France, how, you know, when the summers have been very hot and they've had to turn off their. Precisely. Exactly. And then Hugo over there. Excuse me.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Brian. For the two Royal Navy officers on the panel, what capabilities can Britain reasonably deploy to the Baltic Sea region, and why would it ever choose to do so?
Right, okay, so a lot to tackle there. To the first question on Baltic gas supplies and to what extent perhaps they've, you know, if they're still getting Russian gas repackaged. Would you like to take that first? Thank you.
I think, well, Baltic countries, as Isabella mentioned as well, they've tried early on to diversify as much as possible away from Russian gas. But the point to make is, of course, it's a very small market. All three Baltic countries, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, it's a very, very small market. And Poland next door, obviously, much bigger, times bigger market than three Baltic countries together. So in terms of banning Russian gas imports, in fact, two Baltic countries, I think it's Latvia and Estonia, I think, the two, I wouldn't be completely sure about all three of them, but 2 out of 3 banned legislatively imports of Russian gas. So it actually passed as legislation. It's the only countries in the EU who did it, so that's prohibited to do so. In terms of repackaging or whatever, you know, these countries, they're part of the EU internal gas market. They're all connected through pipelines. And for example, the Baltic connector between Finland and Estonia, that's sort of a domestic infrastructure, and it could serve, you know, to bring supplies from Finland into Estonia and vice versa. And Finland actually this winter was hard pressed because of this incident on Baltic connector. But so through these pipelines, and GPL, Isabella mentioned, that's a pipeline connecting Poland and Lithuania, and there is big storage capacity in Latvia. So it's all part of the EU market. So these gas supplies are sourced from the market. And you can't tell one molecule from another molecule. But Finland, during outage of the interconnector, was sourcing all of its supplies through LNG because it couldn't rely on the Baltic region, and that has its technical issues because it was quite cold few weeks and was icing and was sort of a close call for Finland this winter. But effectively, the question for those countries which wanted to, you know, reduce or eliminate dependence on Russian gas, they pretty much already mostly done so. Other countries consider that small share of Russian gas in their balances is not such a security threat for them because they're well diversified. Even if they lose those supplies, they can quite easily source supplies from elsewhere, and they don't have this particular attitude. But for the Baltics, I think it's pretty much gone, I think, yeah.
Thank you very much. The next question on nuclear, I'm going to put to you, Isabella. I just want to quickly, if that's all right, I just want to quickly package that as well with a general point, a question too as well about kind of decarbonization. Because of course you mentioned, well, Katja mentioned as well, you mentioned as well, this is of course one of the big areas, and you know, as we see there, you know, the Baltic is getting crowded and it's only getting more crowded. Of course we have, you know, these new energy concepts from Bornholm Energy Islands, you know, among others, that will basically see many more offshore wind farms being built, thousands of more kilometers of cable being laid to supply and to, you know, network those together, obviously with the mainlands of Germany, Denmark, etc. So if you don't mind tackling this question on nuclear with also this broader point about what this new boom in renewable energy in the region will also mean, also from a security standpoint as well.
Yes, if you don't mind, I would actually want to go back also to the first question about the Baltic states, because Lithuania was the first country to cut off like all the supply of import of Russian gas, and it was able to do that because of its LNG independence. So the Baltic states, they cut off, like when it comes to piped gas very quickly. When it comes to LNG, I don't have exact data, it's hard to investigate, but I really don't think that it would be coming from Russian sources because LNG is in Klaipeda, and another one is basically the rented one between Estonia and Finland. The whole point of having those LNG terminals was to diversify. However, there's a bigger problem at the level of the EU, because when EU likes to compare data between 2022 first quarter and 2023, when it shows that LNG imports from Russia really like dropped. But if we look 1 year before, 2021, it looks that we are actually, EU is one of the still biggest importers of Russian LNG. So it is entering EU market. This is a problem. And this is gas, but another problem is with oil. And even though there are oil sanctions, we don't import like petroleum products so much, but when India is buying a lot of Russian crude oil and then like manufacturing it and basically selling us the product. So we are buying way more of this processed oil products from India, and basically Russia is like circumventing the sanctions. So these are, I think, the bigger projects, bigger problems, sorry, at this scale. What does it mean to have so much infrastructure? Of course, good for security of supply, traditionally understood, right? A lot of green energy and the potential to develop it further, like hydrogen and so on. Not so good when it comes to monitoring, but then I think we again are going back to the to the point about the resilience of the system. It is gonna become even more difficult to really like monitor each and every project and every inch. So it really becomes a matter of systemic solutions that will work, and basically having those protocols and governance structure and everything in place. Mm-hmm.
And then also specifically, I think we have this question on nuclear in Sweden and its resiliency.
If I understood you correctly, so what would happen if the nuclear power was out of the picture?
How good do you think the quality of the nuclear power plants are in general? If they're already at risk of something's going off or being decommissioned, for example?
Not that I'm aware of, but like Sweden had this debate some time ago, and they decided not to proceed with, like, not to construct any new power plants, nuclear power plants, because they wanted to really transition. They have hydro and wind power. After the outbreak of war in Ukraine, there was a debate, especially that there was election in Sweden, that, oh, perhaps this was like hasty decision, perhaps we should think about something else. And what the debate is now about is actually small modular reactors. So this like smaller nuclear units, also in Finland, also in Estonia, also in Poland, those debates are happening, which are supposedly, easier to deploy and safer and so on. So I think the future will be more in that direction, while the nuclear power plants, the old ones, are still in operation, but they are closely shutting down.
Thank you very much. And Hugo's question to our two guests from the Royal Navy.
So I'm going to do the same thing as well, I'm afraid, and go back one question, if I may, because civil nuclear is not my area of expertise, but nuclear I can talk a bit to. So if you'll allow me, I'll offer a few observations on your point. I mean, there are obviously a number of other things that can cause disruption to nuclear power generation, of which I think you could categorise quite a lot of them as age-related issues, both the ability to keep old plants running, the relative improvement in safety standards and performance standards that newer designs have got, and the potential for unforeseen issues forcing a shutdown of an older plant, I think is an important facet. I mean, in Europe, in North America as well, there's been a reluctance to invest in new nuclear designs for a long time, so that the average age of the civil nuclear has increased, and so that potential, that risk goes up the whole time. Newer designs are better, undoubtedly, safer, technically better, but still, inevitably come across the challenges of the economics, of public perception. We've mentioned Germany already. The example you gave there of Sweden and elsewhere, rightly or wrongly, also plays a part. Small modular reactors are, definitely a thing, and I think we'll see. We've seen in this country, and we'll see elsewhere, an ambition to get after them. Some of the same problems exist, but certainly that ability to disperse, I suppose, is the word I'd use, or to spread your generation capacity about, find it closer to where the need is potentially, offers a degree of resilience, and I think perhaps has some attractiveness on that front. So there's just, some observations on the nuclear side. If I'm happy, I'll move on to the third question, which, as I understood it, was what capabilities could we deploy to the Baltic, and why wouldn't we? So I'm going to be really glib. It was a glib question. It's not a glib question. I'll answer glibly. Yeah, so anything is the answer to the first question. And we do, of course, send various capabilities, warships and others, to the Baltic Sea regularly. Why wouldn't we, in general? Well, I think I'd go back to my earlier point about the team sport thing. It's about having, at an international, multinational level, the right capabilities and the right people in the right place. And that may well argue that the wider benefit is for the Royal Navy of the UK to have its capabilities doing something else somewhere else. And perhaps it's for Baltic nations, to look after the Baltics. So that would be an argument about why not. That's a very simple answer to what is obviously a very nuanced question. And I'll allow Brian to give a much better answer now.
Sorry. So Hugo, great question. Thanks. I think it's important first to divide the answer between time of tension, which you could argue we are living in now, so some ramp of tension leading to conflict, and that time of imminence and conduct of the fight. So if you look back over the last few years, the Royal Navy has maintained a drumbeat of presence in the Baltic. I myself was part of the planning team for the 2019 deployment into the Baltic by the Amphibious Task Group. There is the routine Baltops exercise run most years, now led by Strike Force NATO out of Lisbon, but the UK routinely participate in that. For a long time, that exercise is focused on how to seize Bornholm from a notional hostile person or state. This has been a much studied problem. I think more topically, in response to the Nord Stream blasts, the Navy provided both a frigate and I believe some mine hunters into the region as a signal of our commitment to regional security within the Baltic Sea, but also our ability to act in the maritime. So there is a maritime flank there. You know as well as I, it is an extraordinarily difficult littoral region. So, in conflict with our GEF partners, with our NATO allies where necessary, the Royal Navy is of course ready to act. There are any number of roles that could be performed within the Baltic. It is a congested and difficult area to fight. Why do I mention the fight? Because I think if you then switch to the imminence of conflict and the conduct of the fight, exactly what Commodore Andy has said, our role probably lies elsewhere. And I would divide the Royal Navy's most likely outputs in a fight with Russia into three things. Securing the North Atlantic, both for the free flow of reinforcements into Europe, but also for the benefit of our own nuclear deterrent. And again, a team sport. Conducting deep strike, wherever that may need to be required. And the third of these is perhaps the hardest to resource, is what I would loosely term as theater security in Northwest Europe. So if you think about a conventional conflict at scale in Europe, there's going to be an awful lot of logistics going on. There's going to be an awful lot of ships trying to get into a select number of ports. They are vulnerable to attack, as is critical national infrastructure, and there would undoubtedly be a role to provide that surveillance, indicators and warning, constabulary tasks, and so forth. That could lead the Royal Navy back into the Baltic in conflict. But my sense is that the navies which live and work in the Baltic on a day-to-day basis, they've got that pretty well covered.
Great, thank you very much. I'm afraid that is a wrap. I think that's a fantastic way to end this. Please join me first in thanking our wonderful panel here for sharing their expertise and knowledge and time, importantly. And I would also very much like to thank our partners at the Royal Navy, and indeed in particular from the Council on Geostrategy, for helping to put on this fantastic event, and for indeed coming up from London and participating here in this as well. So ladies and gentlemen, we will have a drinks reception right across the way. I don't want to stand in the way of anyone here when it comes to drinks, just straight across, and thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you.